Welcome to Us and Flux Conversations from the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. Thanks for being with us today. My name is Joey Eschrich, and I'm the editor and program manager at the Center, where we use the tools of speculative fiction to get people thinking about our future in ways that are inclusive, imaginative, and inspiring. And Us and Flux is one of our responses to these strange and trying times. Every other week, we publish a short story that explores themes of community, collaboration, and collective imagination in response to transformative events. And then we host a public conversation like this one to go even deeper on those topics. And our fourth story was published last Thursday. It's titled A Room of One's Own by Tochi Onyebuchi. Tochi, who's with us today, is the author of the award-winning young adult novel Beasts Made of Night and a couple other young adult novels, as well as Riot Baby, which came out January of this year from Tor.com, a novel for adults. And we're proud to have Tochi as part of this series. And Tochi, we're so glad that you're with us here today.
Thank you for having me. A pleasure and an honor.
We're also joined today by Michael G. Bennett, the Assistant Director for Innovation Policy at ASU's School for the Future of Innovation and Society, and a fellow at the Imaginary College at our center. Michael holds degrees in law, physics, and science and technology studies. So for a variety of reasons, we think he's going to bring some interesting perspectives to this conversation in dialogue with Tochi and the story. So thanks so much, Michael, for being with us today as well.
Great to see everyone.
And Michael is in an idyllic outdoor environment. The other two of us are trapped in offices, so I'm loving that. Without any further ado, let's just jump right in. So Tochi, when we start these, we usually like to just get people on the same page about the story if they haven't read it or if it's been a few days. So could you start by telling us a little bit about the piece and what inspired it?
Certainly. So A Room of One's Own is about a woman named Mary who, I guess you could say, exists in this place that's sort of outside of time. And I wanted to use the story as a way to explore issues of quantum mechanics, particularly quantum entanglement, that have been fascinating me for a very, very, very long time. And that, interestingly enough, seemed very apropos given the current state of affairs, given the pandemic-shaped elephant in the room. But yeah, it was, it's a story about this woman and about self-care and about the multiplicity, I guess you could say, of the human experience.
So I think to understand this story as well, it's helpful to understand some of the science that's behind it. So, this story is told through the medium in some ways of some quantum physics principles. And I actually just watched a documentary about quantum physics the other day and was marveling at just like how difficult it is to kind of get your head around those. Sometimes you see the announcer, the me in the situation twisting themselves in knots trying to explain and find the right metaphor. Luckily, the story furnishes a bunch of those metaphors for us. But could you talk just a little bit about a couple of the concepts that you feel are at the heart of the story and that help unlock it for readers?
Certainly. I think the real vertebrae of the story is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And so that's basically a theory that posits that instead of there being just one reality and all sort of possibilities collapsing into that reality, there are actually multiple realities, multiple outcomes. So I guess if you look at the example of Schrodinger's cat, for instance, right? The cat, upon opening the box, is either revealed to be alive or dead, right? And, before the box is opened and before anybody can observe it, there's this idea that both realities are sort of happening simultaneously until somebody observes, right? And then traditionally, you open the box and the cat is one of two things, right? But in the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, you open the box and both realities exist. Both worlds exist, right? There's a world wherein the cat is dead, and that's a valid and real and concrete reality. And then there's another world in which the cat is alive and thriving. And that is also a real and concrete reality. And so that, like, as a science fiction writer, that's just something that I have so much fun thinking about. It's almost like I mean, it is alternative reality, but it's the idea of these alternative realities living right next to each other.
So thank you for that, by the way. I needed that. I want to get us started like in the thick of things and get us neck deep immediately. So, this is this multiple reality story, and this story about the tangling together of what is, what might be, what has been, what might happen next. And as we collectively kind of got our heads around this story you'd written, Tochi, we talked a lot about the potential implications of thinking about reality this way, of thinking about time this way, of thinking about the sequence of events and happenstance this way. So I just want to get us talking about that and what the political implications and potentials of that are, of this multiverse theory. Like, how does it explode the way that we are used to thinking about our lives in the universe? And unexpectedly, how do we sort of wire up politics and physics in this way?
Certainly. I think so. One of the things that I noticed very, very, very early on, when a lot of the shelter in place or the stay-at-home orders started to go into effect across the country, particularly among my creative peers, was the notion that they were not doing the best that they could to take advantage of the current situation. So, there was always regret that, now I have all this free time, or free quote unquote time, given that, my events have been canceled and I'm sort of stuck at home, and, there are minimal distractions by virtue of the fact that my life is immensely constricted. I should use this time to catch up on all the books I've been meaning to read, or I should really get to work on those projects that have impending deadlines, or, I should learn another language, or I should, pick up guitar again, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, playing into this sort of productivity Jones, or this impulse towards constant work / self-improvement, right? And I think one of the things that was happening was we were imagining all these alternative selves that were the me that uses this time to get really good at guitar. And then there's the me that uses this time to get back into Rosetta Stone Japanese. And then there's the me that can like concentrate and get done all the things that I need to get done and finish the things that I need to finish. And conversely, there's also the me that, is just bedridden with depression, right? Or there's the me that is like on the complete opposite end of the spectrum with regards to productivity and self-care. And there's the me that, has an apartment full of half empty like Domino's boxes and whatnot. And so like, we're thinking of all these different could have beens or could be's. And one of the things that I was thinking about was what would it look like if those things existed, if those were both external realities that existed simultaneously, right? Like we contain all these possibilities within us. What would it look like if all of those things were realized at the same time?
Michael, I want to invite you to jump in here. Both about this possible selves conundrum and also and how that's come to a head recently, but also these broader questions about the politics of a multiverse conception of reality.
Yeah, of course. And so let's begin at the beginning, right? The name of this lovely and really kind of amazing, explosive story. I'll say something about that in a moment, but let's just begin right at the title, A Room of One's Own. Most of us, I'm sure, recognize this as a very blunt reference to Virginia Woolf, and not just to Virginia Woolf, but to a very particular moment in her speaking and writing career. The same title sits at the head of a short book-length essay that she composed that makes a strong gender politics argument for the needs of women writers, right? That they would need some material support, some money, some cash, shekels, but also a space, a quiet space. A pretty profound argument for the 19th century, but one that set off a whole chain of responses and kind of adjacent arguments about what creative women needed generally, and then as time continued to unfold, more specifically, what might women in very particular historical circumstances need? Women of color, in particular. Alice Walker kind of jumped on this essay and stretched it out a bit, applying it to women of color in a very productive kind of way. And so, Tochi, we've spoken, you and I and Joey, have spoken about this a bit, but I'd love to hear you say some more about why you felt that that this Virginia Woolf opening would be really really useful.
Certainly, I found it a very convenient and fantastic framing for this story about the centrality of womanhood, and particularly womanhood as embodied in this specific experience. Or I guess you could say, as the story unfolds, the specific experiences of womanhood and girlhood. And one of the things that I took from, Virginia Woolf's essay, when I first read it and, upon returning to it, was this idea of shifting the mainstream, right? And it's something that Toni Morrison talks about too, when asked about her, the imperative of her personal literary project, right? Shifting the mainstream. It's, when asked, are you ever going to have, white characters in your stories? Are
Right.
you ever, what, white mainstream characters? And Morrison responds essentially that the characters that she has in her stories are the mainstream. They're her mainstream. Like, this is the mainstream of the experience that she wants to explore. And so that was something that I found very compelling about the Virginia Woolf essay, particularly given that it's embodied in this corporal idea of the room, right? This
Yes.
is a space for me to self-actualize, right? And so so it made it very easy to have this framing device for the story that essentially takes place in a single location, in a single, for all intents and purposes, room. And that's this place where you can explore your own interiority, right? You can really delve into whatever work you may need to embark upon to explore and discover and actualize yourself. And that, in many ways, that's sort of what the story is about.
It's super interesting, again, for many reasons, that the title is what it is and opens in this kind of way. But I'm sure that some of the folks that are listening now definitely know Virginia Woolf for this essay, but they also know how things ended for her.
Yeah.
Right? She struggled for much of her life with mental illness. She was extremely depressed, and she ultimately took her own life, weighted herself down, and walked into the water. In this particular moment, I imagine many of us are wrestling with the darker regions of ourselves, right, and isolation. And so I'm curious about that too, right? We get all of Virginia Woolf, I'm imagining, with this kind of opening. So her demise, did it play much into your thinking about situating her at the very front of the story?
Yeah, and it's something that, so there are a lot of specific, I guess you could say, political and cultural references sprinkled throughout the story. And, one of the things that I wanted to imply with that is the idea of containing multitudes. And so to dive a little deeper into that, containing multitudes along certain, first of all, like political vectors, right? Or personal and political vectors. So if we're going to have this allusion to Virginia Woolf, this opens us out to the entirety of Virginia Woolf, sort of all the details that you've been getting into. There's a reference very early on to Malcolm X. And
Yes.
we get, and that opens the door to the experience of all of Malcolm X, right? Not just, Detroit Red, and not just early Malcolm, Nation of Islam, and not just Malcolm after the break, and not just Malcolm, after, the Hajj, all of those Malcolms, right? And so it gets back to this idea of the multiplicity of self, and, how I think, we look back historically, particularly at a lot of these more prominent figures, and there's this sense of inevitability about their journeys, right? Like there's this assumption that the way that Virginia Woolf's life ended was, of course, going to be the way that her life ended, given her own personal trajectory and the state of affairs in the world around her. But so much of life as it's lived is a series of sort of, like, when you're living it, it's often a series of what feels like, coincidence and serendipity and bad luck, like so many of those things. And I wanted to attack that idea of sort of retrospective determinism, right, by getting into this idea of the multiplicity of selves. And I think that is, there's a later reference to C.S. Lewis as well. Like, and you can't necessarily, if you're going to embrace or include a particular figure in your conception, you have to include all of them, right? Like, I just finished reading an essay in the London Review of Books on Winnie Mandela, very polarizing figure in South African politics. And, there's the Winnie Mandela that's venerated, right? Almost untouchable, essentially canonized. And then there's the Winnie Mandela that, was allegedly involved in various murders and acts of violence, and, who had all these flaws and defects of character and everything. And so, when we speak on that, we have to look at the entirety of a person and the mythology that ends up sort of engulfing them afterwards.
It's pretty interesting. I mean, coming back to your Malcolm X reference, what you described about him, that's actually the Malcolm X that we know, right? I mean, he was an incredibly protean figure, transforming himself multiple times in a relatively short period of time, right? His life was truncated, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
And right, to imagine him spread across a multiverse, to imagine any of these nominal figures spread across a multiverse, certainly opens up a completely broad way of reading the story. I think that's one of my favorite parts about what you've written here. It's such a, in some ways, explosive story, potentially explosive, right? It's like a chunk of C4, perhaps. The image that came to mind this morning, and I think everyone that's read it so far that's a Dungeons and Dragons fan will possibly appreciate this. It feels like a cross between Tiamat and a Jack-in-the-Box, right? Like a Jack-in-the-Box that could explode from any of its 6 surfaces, and at times does simultaneously from all of them. And so kudos for the efficiency and the yield of the story that you put out here. But on Malcolm X as well, and perhaps this is an interesting way to quietly link X and Virginia Woolf directly. One of his major continuous political projects was something that we could call imaginary liberation, right? That for him, the argument that he kept coming back to, right, the way he expressed this in my ear at least, was that enslavement, subordination, domination was it's a mind thing, first and foremost, that in order to achieve even a rudimentary level of liberation, a rudimentary level of freedom, that you have to free your mind to begin. And in some ways, that kind of freedom seemed to be at the base of what Woolf was getting at, and her lectures turned into essays, turned into book as well. And I'd love to hear you say whatever you care to say about this project of imaginary liberation as expressed in the story.
Certainly. I mean, that is so much of my personal engine as a writer, as a storyteller. It's in many ways the way that I feel called to contribute to efforts to bring about a more sort of equitable world, right? Is doing my part to expand the imagination, whether that's along a political vector, whether that's along a moral vector, whether it's purely situational, right? You know, a lot of science fictional texts particularly about utopias and dystopia and whatnot, simply, you know, to get us thinking about what things could look like, not necessarily what they will look like, what they might look like, but what they could look like, right? And so, you know, when you know, the 2016 election happened, and it happened to very interestingly coincide with the Handmaid's Tale adaptation on Hulu. And so there was all this talk about prescience and about, you know, imagining our way into a sort of apocalypse. And I think sort of as an undercurrent of that, there's the idea that a lot of these texts carry within them the potential antidote to that sort of thing, right? As though diagnosis and cure were one and the same. But I do think that one of the things that fiction writers are particularly empowered to do is engage in that expansiveness, right? And particularly at this current juncture that we stand at, where so much is in flux, right? There's so much instability right now, and so many of so much of the scaffolding of modern living is falling away or being torn away. You know, one example would be when TSA at one point, I think it was last month or a few months ago, said, okay, we know the liquid restriction on your, you know, the containers and carry-ons. You can carry hand sanitizer that exceeds that, you know, restriction. Revealing in the process that that restriction was nonsense to begin with, that there was no real, you know, public safety imperative behind that. It was, you know, it was just complete and utter nonsense, right? A lot of industries right now, particularly, you know, if you look at publishing in New York, where it was just assumed, it was sort of fait accompli that you had to live in New York to do these jobs and that they couldn't be done remotely. A lot of people are realizing now, by dint of necessity, that a lot of these jobs can be done remotely, that they are being done remotely right now, and that very little is being sacrificed in terms of efficiency, in terms of what have you. So many of these aspects of modern living that were simply there to reinforce a particular status quo are being revealed at the moment to be completely unnecessary, right? And so given that there's this instability with regards to so many aspects of the foundations of modern living, the ability to imagine our way into a better place, a more equitable place, a place where, you know, the Cthulhu like clamp of you know, hyper capitalism isn't quite so strong. Like, I think as fiction writers, we're particularly empowered to do that.
I'm going to break in here just real quick, Michael. I feel like you're winding up. We have a Q&A function in this chat. I should have mentioned that up top. Or in this session. So you have a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. You can use that to submit a question. And in about 15 minutes or so, we'll shift to responding to some of your questions or comments. So please type those in as they occur to you. All right. Resume, please, gentlemen. Time in.
Well, I left off from Virginia a bit too quickly, so I'd like to go back, and I'm exercising all types of restraint right now. That Cthulhu reference it really put a hook in me, right? So we'll have to come back to that given time. But you know, the Virginia Woolf reference, titular certainly, but also a kind of structural nod to her exists in the story, right? That there's I guess you could almost call it a tropic nod to her, because she imagines multiple beings in that essay. It's a really fascinating piece. If folks have not read A Room of One's Own by Virginia Woolf, I would suggest strongly that you couple it with your reading of Tochi's story. It'll pay handsome dividends. But one of the things that happens in there is that she has four Marys as well, right? That she imagines, or allows us to imagine, that the narrator is a Mary, possibly multiple Marys, totaling four as I recall it. And this is it's all the more interesting, again, coupled with what you've done here. But I'll ask you again to answer this question about affinities with her work, with her writing, with her life, but now through this particular tropic nod, right? That we effectively have multiple versions of the same woman, nominally all Marys, four of them, just as Virginia Woolf had four Marys in her essay.
Yeah, no, that like absolutely intentional. And I'm so grateful for every reader that picks up on that particular connection. In part, it was an effort to get back to what you had mentioned earlier about Alice Walker's response to the essay, right? And so in emphasizing the centrality of a specific experience, I wanted to extrapolate that to multiple identities, multiple vectors of identity, right? Across race, across religion. And my hope is that readers will return to the story multiple times and choose as protagonist a different character, right? Because it's entirely possible that, it is Mary's story, and then it's entirely possible that it's Maria's story the entire time, and then it's entirely possible that this is Manon's story, and like, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so from whose eyes are you experiencing the entire story, right? And all these different Marys that exist as externalized, realized possibilities, right? Like that, a lot of it goes back to that is what if we took all these possibilities, right, and we made them concrete? We gave them flesh, we gave them blood, we gave them bone, we gave them all the sort of accoutrement of human beingness, right? What does that look like?
Excellent.
So to open up a new Pandora's box for you two, before we go to questions from our audience members, but all the stories in this series, Us and Flux, are supposed to be talking to, in some ways, themes of community and collaboration, collective imagination. And I was wondering what you all made of that in relation to this story, and the way that this might be a story about a strange kind of community, and what that means in the story, and Tochi, how you felt that it was connected to those themes in this moment.
Certainly, it's in many ways it's a sort of entreaty towards self-care, and a particular brand of self-care, right? Like in this current moment, a lot of people are separated from things that normally would have given them comfort, would have given them solace. They're separated from people that would have given them those things. Their family or loved ones that they want so badly just to engage in physical contact with, right? Or former pastimes like going out and smoking shisha at the shisha like lounge, right? All these things that we'd sort of taken for granted in many cases, or that had given us a sense of peace, right? We don't have access to them, right? And so how do we stabilize, right? Like how do we take care of ourselves? How do we find those things that can alleviate a sort of occasionally crippling sense of loneliness, right? And one possible answer, or at least one piece of an answer, is that like what we're looking for is inside us, right? And it's this idea of being comfortable with yourself, being comfortable in your own skin, right? Being, and that doesn't necessarily mean being certain of your personhood, right? Doesn't mean necessarily having it all together, but there's this, I am very content to have developed the ability over the years to literally just like sit with myself, right? Because there are a lot of times where the most chaotic, place in the entire world is, between my ears and behind my eyes, right? But if you can get to a place where you're comfortable with yourself, you're always going to have yourself. Like that's not, you take yourself everywhere that you go. You can't really leave that behind. And if you can utilize the self as a source of peace and fulfillment and a way to alleviate aloneness, that I think is something that can take you far into this sort of uncertain future that we're walking into.
Yeah. Can I throw out another kind of community thing that I
Absolutely.
Yeah, I've been thinking, I've reread the story like I think we all did this morning. I don't know if you reread it, Tochi, but me and Michael clearly did. Rereading your own story over and over again. It struck me that taking us back to this question about politics and the multiverse and kind of the radical contingency of reality, that thinking about the consequences of our decisions through a story that's about, an expansive many realities interpretation of the universe means that we have more responsibility for what might happen. It makes our decisions, I think in some ways these kind of branching path stories can make people feel like, well, everything happens, so like nothing that I do matters. But on the other hand, I think this story actually shows by having these characters actually meet in this space that there are connections between all of these causalities, that the things that these characters are doing for themselves and for one another, which is maybe one and the same thing, that it ripples out in the universe. It sort of puts a different kind of energy out there in the universe. And I think to anchor this story with these kind of venerable figures, I think of Wolf and Malcolm X, complicated, but figures that I think we all often find things to look up to and love in, that, I don't know, it made me feel a sense of deep moral responsibility, that like, if you're caught in this web of connections and there isn't that inevitability that you were saying that storytelling helps crack open, that sense that like things are the way that they are, and that way that looking back, we say, well, that's the way things turned out, so that's the way they had to turn out. But there are all these other realities, kind of like, I think expands rather than dilutes our responsibility. I don't know if that rings for you or.
No, absolutely. I mean, there's a reason that all the different Marys meet, right? Or all the different Marys are brought to this same place, right? It's not as though, sort of as you were saying, because every outcome is realized in its own universe, we don't need to do our best here. Like that's not at all, what I'm trying to say. It's just that, it's entirely possible that this is the reality that we live into our best self with, right? It's entirely possible that this is the reality where we're able to bring about, the type of future that is, our ideal conception of it, right? This could be the reality where we do the thing that we want to or feel that we need to do, right? We don't need to cede responsibility for bringing about that outcome to an alternate reality.
I've been imagining a much less venerable and a much more venal form of community, right? I got stuck on Flamin' Hot Cheetos, and so I'm imagining
an important noun in the story that hasn't come up yet.
That's right. So I'm imagining for the better part of an hour now, the legal team at Frito-Lay or whatever hellish company produces these things, trying to figure out how to monetize across the multiverse, right?
Yeah.
These Cheetos
Capital finds a way.
Right, right. They're probably on this call now, so don't be surprised. Don't be surprised if they reach out.
Yeah, it does. I don't know. I think these sorts of stories, we published another story like that had multiple timelines, and actually it's about Tobias Bickel, who's an incredible writer. And we published it a couple of years ago. The name is totally escaping me and I feel terrible, but it's about a character who actually ends up finding herself in a situation where she can save people from some of the less fortunate realities. And of course, the people in the more fortunate realities don't want these refugees from the less fortunate realities. So there's these smugglers who are bringing them across. And this story made me think of that, in that it is this like friendly, caring beachhead for these characters who are all trauma survivors. That struck me again this time through, that these were all people who had lived through something, and that they were having to find a way to forge community, even though each of them had this brokenness that they were having to try to repair in some way.
Absolutely.
I can certainly see that.
So Michael, we're going to shift to taking a couple questions in a minute or two, but I wanted to see if you wanted to talk about Cthulhu at all, because you just sort of like Chekhov gunned Cthulhu a little while ago, and then I don't know if we want to leave everyone hanging. Can you do that in a couple of minutes for us and talk to us a little bit more about what you had in mind?
Sure. And I want you to remember that you asked for this, right? I was willing to let this go.
Yeah. No,
this was like Tom Cruise in that Jack Reacher movie. Is like, remember,
I'm going to give you, and we're going to give you like a 5-minute max hard cap on this. So I'm going to stop you.
Just a little piece then, just a little piece. So the old gods, the ancient ones, right? Thumbnail sketch for folks who are not big H.P. Lovecraft fans. Cthulhu is this kind of ancient being, demigod, alien that has been sleeping for millennia, if not longer, and that even in sleep is able to psychically connect with individuals who are sensitive enough. Cthulhu is wrapped in a whole bundle of narratives that are profoundly racist as well. Especially anti-Black forms of racism. H.P. Lovecraft was pretty open about his hatred for people of color, and expressed that in his writings. And to the extent that one thinks on Cthulhu as a productive metaphor, as I often do, a story like this comes along, and you can't help but imagine what the ancient ones might have had to do with not only the creation of the universe, but the creation of the possibility of quantum coherence. And again, Joey, you referenced Cthulhu. Tochi, you referenced it. And so I'm imagining that maybe the two of you have had a chance to speak about this before now. But Tochi, I'm wide open for hearing. If Cthulhu has a room of its own, if Cthulhu is underwriting any of what we're getting in this story, or if perhaps this universe that you've given us a view onto is free of Cthulhu's influence,
free of tentacles.
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the beauty of storytelling, is that I do get to imagine a universe where Cthulhu is a non-entity.
Yes.
So that it is very, but it is something that I think a lot about. N.K. Jemisin recently published her latest novel, The City We Became, and it features a very interesting iteration of the Cthulhu mythos, right? And and the way in which it's sort of integrated and married to particularly the idea of capital, which you could say does have its own cult and is sort of many tentacled in the ways in which it ravages communities or sort of corrupts individuals or even entire landscapes and what have you. So it had been on my mind, but I thankfully was able to allow these particular characters, who I love dearly and deeply, to escape its grasp.
Bless you.
I think we'll go to a couple questions if that's all right with the two of you, and then we'll loop back for at least one more from me. But so first, our colleague actually, Langdon Winner, thanks for joining us, Langdon.
Greetings,
Asks,
Langdon.
he says, as you've mentioned, the present moment creates a break between an existing condition of the normal and extraordinary changes in everyday experience that suggest a radical shift, pointing to novel possibilities ahead. What would be involved in moving toward that new encounter rather than a frantic quest to restore the normal?
Oh my goodness. I think so much about this particular question. I think a lot of it goes toward, because like that's the peril, right? Is that we're going through all of this, right? And then the powers that be will, under I guess you could say the guise of the pretense of restoring order, sort of refashion and in many ways redouble a lot of those strictures of modern living, or a lot of that status quo, which led to this sort of thing in the first place, right? I think that, sort of on the individual level there, this allows for a sort of radical questioning of a lot of the assumptions that we have um, about the way that we live. And one example of that would be, one interesting thing that's happening is I'm reading about and hearing more and more stories of students, of high school students who are graduating or nearing that point where college admissions becomes a reality, and they're changing what schools that they go to based on factors that have become increasingly important to them as a result of the pandemic. Deciding to remain closer to home, deciding that, if I'm not going to be on campus for a semester or however long, does it make sense for me to go to this school that has a brand name or whatever, or that had a particular program that I really wanted to get involved with, if I'm not going to be around, if I'm not going to be able to stop by a professor's office for office hours in the same way, if I'm not going to be able to take advantage of these world-class like athletic facilities and what have you. So that's one example of how on an individual level we can start to sort of question a lot of the assumptions that underpinned modern living. I think on a structural level, like a very fascinating thing happened very early on. So given my previous work in sort of civil rights law, particularly with regards to mass incarceration, I think a lot about prisons and jails and other sort of carceral aspects of American society. And one of the very early things that happened when COVID-19 started really ravaging certain communities was you had jail administrators and prison administrators in Connecticut asking prosecutors to sort of lighten up on arrests for low-level offenses, because they didn't want there to be a constantly changing population in their facilities, given the ways in which the coronavirus is transmitted. And you have to ask yourself, okay, if they can do with not arresting people at the same volume as they were before for public safety reasons, why were they doing it to begin with, right? And so I think on the larger, more socio-political level, this moment allows for us to question things like that we had sort of just taken for granted. And how we react, that can vary on a number of levels. There's electorally, there's with regards to our activism, there's with regards to the resources financially that we decide to put towards a particular organization or function or what have you. And there are a lot of people, particularly organizers, that are much well versed in imagining these sorts of these moral imperatives and these alternative outcomes and methods of action and activism than I am and than I can be. But I do think like this moment allows for that sort of contemplation.
One of the reasons that I love science fiction so much and have for forever, essentially, is kind of boring. Actually, it's the didactic quality of it, right? That So much science fiction, English language science fiction in particular, Anglo-American science fiction, I guess technically, has been for more than, well, virtually 100 years, concerned with teaching us about new things, right? Both at the level of its structure, right? Imagining things that have not happened, but also in the particular. So the tropic turns, the subject matter, the experiences of the characters, so often teaching us about the sciences, soft and hard and everything in between. And so bearing that long-term love in mind, one of the things that I think, going to Langdon's question, one of the things that I think is absolutely essential, particularly in a moment like this, is for our creative class to continue producing very high quality work that crystallizes our concerns and our thoughts for us. This is why I don't worry about the overflow of dark science fiction. It is a bummer, but it's appropriate for the moment, right? And to the extent that those narratives describe potentials, ways to move, even incrementally, in directions that are more humane, I'm all for it. So I think Talib Kweli says something very similar, right? That's the whole point of political art, to crystallize your thoughts and make the revolution irresistible, I think is the way he puts it.
Mm-hmm. You know, this for some reason is reminding me of an essay I read this morning. So I mentioned Michael's a fellow of our Imaginary College at the center, and another fellow is Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote in the New Yorker this weekend about the coronavirus ushering in what he called the beginnings of a new structure of feeling, borrowing a term from Raymond Williams, the cultural theorist. And part of what he thought was important, and this is, I think your point about science fiction and didacticism reminded me of this, Michael, that this was an example of scientists, in a certain group, bioscientists, warning us about something for decades, and now something actually happening. And then though the recommendations of that community that had long been ignored, public health officials, kind of starting to get integrated into civic life. We're seeing contact tracers trained all over the place. I just heard an interview with the mayor of New Orleans, and she talked about contact tracing and community spread, all this public health jargon, like entering into pretty mainstream media conversation and policy talk. So in some ways, he felt like perhaps a slightly more scientific worldview was by necessity starting to creep into into our structure of feeling. At least that's my reading of part of the essay. It goes to a lot more places than that, but I thought that was very interesting and did remind me of the way that like science fiction functions as a language for me to understand so many of these issues as someone without a scientific background. And it goes to political stuff too. I was trying to explain like anarchism to somebody a while ago, and I the only thing I was just like, let me talk to you about The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. Like I was like, I couldn't do anything outside of the rhetoric of the story itself. I was like, this is about as good as I'm going to be able to do, is like just recapitulating the plot of a science fiction novel you haven't read.
Yeah, just throw them some China Mieville, like yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So on to another question. This is from Caleb. He says, this has been so much fun to watch. Thanks, Caleb. And Caleb asks, what are some great works, novels, TV, video games, anime, whatever, you've consumed that brilliantly utilize the concept of quantum mechanics? Do you have any quantum mechanics favorites?
Oh my goodness, I love quantum mechanics narratives. There was this TV show. I guess it's technically a miniseries that was done by FX, and that is streaming on Hulu, called Devs, and it hit all of my buttons, right? Like it was absolutely amazing. So essentially, it sort of starts out as this murder mystery, and the protagonist is this young software developer who works at this enigmatic tech company, and her boyfriend goes missing and is later discovered to have been sort of murdered on the premises. And as she dives deeper into figuring out what happened to him, we find out more and more about the project that he was slated to have been involved in. And it gets into like all these extraordinary, it's one of the things that I loved about it so much, aside from, you know, the absolutely haunting score, the incredible dynamic visuals, the performances that just really, really, really spoke to me, was that it had all these wonderful examples of visual demonstrations and depictions of concepts in quantum mechanics. And so there are a couple instances where the ever interpretation, the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics is beautifully depicted.
Mm.
And it's because it can be so difficult to visualize that sort of thing. Even just like using examples like Schrodinger's cat, like even that can get a little dicey. And if you can find compelling ways to, in a way that blends seamlessly with the story, demonstrate those concepts and make them sort of, you know, visually digestible, like that, I think is really, really, really impressive. So yeah, devs, I like that immediately jumps to mind.
Michael, anything?
Well, Tochi, you snatched that one from me. I was definitely gonna put it out there. And hat tip to my dear friends, Jelani Alexander out at Boeing, and then Stephen Chaviro at Wayne State for recommending that early on, devs. Thank you. But I guess there's one more relatively recent one that does not delve so much into the weeds of quantum mechanics, but is certainly concerned with the ever interpretation, and that's Man in the High Castle, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we've got really interesting multiverse, parallel universes at work there, and I think one of the most fun for me is the old 1990s Jet Li film, The One, right? Which is a really beautiful film. It's got some gems on the backside of that DVD for those who are out there still using that ancient technology. Highly recommended. But perhaps the greatest virtue of the film, one of the greatest virtues, is that before the story even unfolds, it's so bold as to try and explain the epic interpretation to you. So it lays out how a multiverse actually works and why it is as it is. So highly recommended. Jet Li's The One.
So I was scrounging around in the bookshelf behind me and found the name of the short story that I was trying to plug earlier unsuccessfully. It's by Tobias Eschrich, and it's called A World to Die For. And it's both in a book that we had a hand in, A Year Without a Winner, but you can also find it online and again in an act of tragic forgetting. I don't know which science fiction magazine published it, but if you look around online for A World to Die For by Tobias Eschrich, you can find that. That sort of has to do with climate change and multiple realities, and it's also like this ripping action yarn. It'd be a great pair with Tochi's story, which is the kind of a bottle episode. And this one has full on like road warrior, you know, car chases and things like that. So Carmela from the audience asked if there was any love for Into the Spider-Verse on this call.
Oh my goodness. Yes. That in my mind, that was the best movie of 2018. I love that movie so much. So much. Oh my God. It's so good.
So there is a lot of love, Carmela.
Yes.
Michael, I think you're on mute if you want to add anything. Otherwise, we'll go to a final question from the audience before we wrap up.
I was just seconding the comment. Yes.
3 for 3 on Into the Spider-Verse. You should go see that if you haven't for some reason already. All right. So, and I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, Gaudis asks or says, things will no longer be the same as a result of the pandemic. How do we find a balance between the use of tracing applications and the amount of, this is going to get back to the story in a sec, but tracing applications in the amount of information being transmitted over the net and moral imperatives? So how do we deal with privacy issues and contact tracing in terms of individual privacy versus institutional imperatives? And how can we use science fiction to address these matters? So I think this idea, this is why I wanted to pose this to help us close out, because it gets to like, what can we take and move forward with in this story? How do we take a story like this that's about this really radical spate of possibilities and apply it to like some of these challenging questions that we're going to have to deal with about how we're going to live together and what we're going to be open to and closed to in terms of institutions and people. So I'll let you two chew on that before I wrap us up.
Yeah, no, I think the stories operate as thought experiments in a certain way. They allow us to extrapolate in very concrete fashion what they allow us to work through in extrapolating these futures and these outcomes, what we feel we are willing to live with, right? Because it's a very important question. The public health imperative that will that underpins things like contact tracing, when it butts up against privacy concerns, and when you introduce a criminalizing aspect to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, if through contact tracing through like a phone app or whatever, you discover that somebody has broken some ordinance or whatever and has in some way, shape, or form endangered the public or what have you, and then you start arresting people or fining people or in some way, shape, or form criminalizing behavior that is discoverable through potential invasions of privacy. Like, what is that? What do we do with that, right?
Yeah.
And I certainly don't know the answer to that, but I think one thing that serves as a point of reference is the Patriot Act, right? Like, there was this incredible rush to forfeit all these civil liberties in the face of concern for homeland security, quote unquote. And that, like, it's very, these are all things that we need to think about, right? Because I think there's the tendency, particularly when there is a very immediate public danger, to think about, okay, let's do everything that we can to stem the bleeding or fix the thing, right? And then we'll deal with the consequences later. But it bears thinking about the implications of a thing like methods of contact tracing. It bears thinking about those things now, because we're going to have to live in that future.
Yeah. Michael, what if any role does science fiction play as like decision makers are approaching these issues? I don't know if you have any experience with that, but the way that like nonprofits or tech companies or governments around the world might be looking to stories and narratives to start conversations or frame them around these questions.
Yes. I think it's playing an increasingly prominent role. Certainly has played a meaningful role for at least 60 or 70 years. I mean, multiple U.S. agencies alone have turned to science fiction authors since the wake of the Second World War in order to get some kind of purchase on possible futures, to think creatively or quote unquote out of the box about how they might deploy and how they might address impending futures, threats, so forth. And more recently, say within the last 5 years or so, we've seen many corporations, many NGOs commissioning science fiction authors to effectively help these institutions and organizations achieve a degree of imaginary liberation, right? Organizational imaginary liberation, right? To take the shackles off of their collective minds and their thinking about how they might move into an uncertain future. And so I'm of multiple minds about this. At a certain point, I was pretty staunchly invested in this as a form of instrumentalization of the genre that I didn't particularly care for. But then I started experimenting, doing it myself, and so now I have a much messier take on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's certainly happening. I think it's happening at a quicker pace these days. Most recently, I think it was Deloitte that released a COVID-19 inspired white paper that was co-written and or co-edited by some of the remnants of the Global Business Network, which effectively was a futurist outfit sprinkled with science fiction authors based out in the Bay Area. And Deloitte is about as straight-laced as it comes, right? This giant multinational tax accountant collective, basically. And so that's, I think, a measure of it. But Lowe's has done this as well. And again, many pieces of the U.S. Governmental state apparatus too.
All right. Oh, I'm gonna give you 10 more seconds, Michael.
No,
please. This is my fault for timekeeping. Okay.
Please.
All right. Well, after I so rudely interrupted you, I'm just going to thank you both for joining us today. And thank you all for hanging with us for the full hour, everyone who joined us in the audience. Tochi, Michael, could you each just tell us very quickly a good place to find you and your work online?
Absolutely. You can find my work and updates on what's going on with that work at my website, tochionyebuchi.com. Also, if you want something a little more free-flowing, I tweet, and you can follow me at Tochi True Story. And I'm also on Instagram at Treyze64. That's TREIZE 64. And yeah, I think that's it.
All right, Michael.
Online, I'm Michael G. Bennett, in quotes, with ASU, and I'll pop up. If you use just Michael Bennett, there's legions of us. It's painfully common name.
Might end up with a member of Congress instead of
exactly,
or the football player.
Or a football player. Yeah.
Exactly. So Michael G. Bennett, ASU, and then I tweet pretty regularly. So MG Bennett, 2 N's, 2 T's is the handle.
And, feel free to send any of your quantum entanglement questions to the football player, Michael Bennett, also.
Yes.
All right. So our next Us in Flux story is titled Skating Without Streetlights. It's by Tina Connolly, and it'll publish next Thursday, May 14th. And we'll have another conversation in one of these conversations in 2 weeks with Tina and a virtual reality technology expert, Dennis Bonilla, on Monday, May 18th at the same time, 4 p.m. Eastern. You can find all the Us in Flux stories and register for our events and watch videos of past events at csi.asu.edu/usinflux. And thanks again for being here with us, for supporting us and making it possible for us to do this, for reading these stories and being part of our community during this time. And Tochi and Michael, thank you once again for taking the time to have this conversation with me.
Of course, a great pleasure. Great to see both of you and to talk with both of you, and great to see you in good health as well. I hope everyone that's listening is safe as well too. Thanks for chiming in.
Yes.
Likewise.
All right, everybody stay safe out there and have a lovely afternoon and evening. Goodbye.
Bye.